By 1995, fewer than 1 in 3 British households sat down to a Sunday roast, a tradition that had anchored working-class and middle-class life for over a century. The one meal that meant something, the 1 hour when nothing else mattered, had quietly collapsed in a single generation. If you grew up with the smell of gravy drifting through the house on a Sunday morning, you already know what was lost. This is file number 14 of the Forgotten Britain archive. There are people alive today who cannot name a single cut of beef, who have never rendered dripping, who would not know what to do with a roasting tin if you put one in their hands. That is not a judgment. It is a measure of how completely this tradition was dismantled, not by war, not by poverty, but by convenience, by economics, and by a set of decisions made in boardrooms and government offices that nobody voted on. What follows is the story of how the Sunday roast died, not the sentimental version, the real one, with dates and figures, and the specific, traceable moments when something irreplaceable was quietly killed. The Sunday roast was never simply a meal. It was a social structure. In a working-class household in Bradford, Coventry, or Swansea, in 1955, the entire week bent around Sunday dinner. The joint was purchased on Friday from the butcher, not a supermarket, because supermarkets barely existed, and it was the single largest household expenditure of the week. A topside of beef from a Sheffield butcher in 1958 cost around 4 shillings and sixpence for 2 pounds of meat, which in today's money is roughly £8. But in 1958, that represented nearly 4% of a manual labourer's weekly wage. You bought it carefully. You made it last. The cooking began on Saturday evening in many households. The meat went into a cold larder, not a refrigerator, because in 1955, fewer than 8% of British homes owned one, and it was brought to temperature slowly. Sunday morning meant the oven on by 9, the vegetables prepared by hand, the fat rendered from whatever dripping had been saved during the week in a ceramic pot, kept beside the stove. Nothing was bought ready-made. Nothing was thrown away, and what that process produced, beyond food, was time. Shared, structured, unhurried time. In a country that had spent 6 years rationing everything from butter to clothing, the Sunday roast was the proof that the war was over, that there was enough, that life could, on at least one day of 7, be ceremonial. That world began to crack in 1956. The year is precise and provable. It was the year that Bird's Eye introduced the first frozen TV dinner to the British market. It was marketed not as a replacement for Sunday cooking, but as a weekday convenience, a way for working women to feed families faster on a Tuesday. Nobody framed it as an attack on tradition. It never is. But what it introduced was something far more powerful than a product. It introduced the idea that cooking could be optional. The second rupture came in 1961, when the first self-service supermarket chain, Fine Fare, expanded into 200 towns across England and Wales within 18 months. The relationship between the housewife and the butcher, a relationship built on trust, on specific cuts being held back, on the butcher, knowing your family's preferences, was replaced by a refrigerated display case and a standardized pre-wrapped joint. By 1965, independent high street butchers had declined by 31% from their 1,950 peak. The knowledge that lived inside those shops which cut to use, how to lard a leg of lamb, what temperature meant, what began to leave the culture. But the Sunday roast was still being cooked. Battered, yes. Simplified, certainly. But it persisted through the 1960s and into the 1970s because it was embedded in something that could not yet be easily replaced: Sunday itself. In England and Wales until 1994, Sunday trading was governed by the Shops Act of 1950. Under that act, most shops were legally prohibited from opening on Sundays. Supermarkets could not open. Clothing shops could not open. The day was structurally different from every other day of the week. You could not fill it with shopping. You could not fill it with errands. It pressed you, gently but firmly, back into the home. The Sunday Trading Act of 1994 dismantled that structure. From August of that year, Large shops were permitted to open for 6 continuous hours on Sundays. It was presented as liberation, freedom to shop when you chose, to spend your day as you wished. And within 3 years, Sunday footfall in British retail centres had increased by 44%. People were not sitting around the table anymore. They were in Meadowhall. They were in the Trafford Centre. They were, quite literally, somewhere else. The economics accelerated what the culture had already weakened. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, the cost of a decent joint of beef rose faster than wages. A silver side of beef that cost the equivalent of £8 in today's money in 1958 cost the equivalent of £22 by 1983. The response was not to abandon the roast entirely, it was to replace beef with chicken. And here is the detail that tells you everything. In 1960, chicken was the most expensive meat you could buy. A whole roasting bird was a luxury, reserved for Christmas and high days. By 1985, following the industrialization of poultry farming, chicken had become the cheapest protein on the British table. The Sunday roast did not die, it cheapened. It contracted. It became a thing done with less care, less time, less ceremony. By the late 1980s, the final blow was being prepared in the food industry laboratories of Wiltshire and Cambridgeshire. The chilled ready meal, not the frozen TV dinner of 1956, but a refrigerated, premium-positioned, cook-in 30-minute Sunday lunch, arrived on supermarket shelves around 1987. Marks & Spencer was the pioneer. Their chilled roast chicken with all the trimmings was priced at £3.99 in 1989, the equivalent of roughly £11 today. It was not cheap. It was not presented as cheap. It was presented as sophisticated, as the choice of people who had better things to do than stand over a roasting tin for 3 hours. The message was unmistakable. Real cooking was for people who had nothing else going on, and by 1989, Britain had plenty going on. The mothers and grandmothers who held this tradition in their hands, who knew instinctively when a joint was ready by pressing it, who could make a gravy from pan drippings and a splash of Bisto that bore no relation to anything that came out of a packet, those women were not replaced. Their knowledge simply was not passed on, because by the time their daughters were running households of their own, there was no structural reason to learn it. Sunday was no longer protected time. The joint was no longer the week's anchor. The kitchen was no longer the center of the Sunday house. There is a coda to this. In 2001, the Food Standards Agency published a survey showing that 67% of British adults under the age of 35 could not correctly identify the internal temperature at which beef was safe to eat, not whether it was delicious, whether it was safe. The knowledge had not merely faded, it had been surgically removed from a generation in the space of about 25 years. The Sunday roast still exists, of course. You can order it in a pub for £15. You can buy a pre-prepared version from Waitrose. You can watch someone make it on a screen. But the knowledge that lived in the hands of the woman standing at the stove, the embodied, transmitted, weekly practiced skill, that is gone. It did not vanish in a fire. It was replaced, piece by piece, by things that were easier, and easier, in this case, meant permanent loss. If you remember the smell of a joint coming out of the oven on a Sunday morning, if your mam or your nan could produce a roast dinner with no written recipe, no digital thermometer, no pre-prepared anything, leave a note below. Every memory you share is part of the archive. Every detail you recall is something we are choosing, together, not to let disappear entirely. This was file No. 14 of The Forgotten Britain Archive. There are 99 more in the archive. Subscribe and turn the page with us.